Welcome to Valid History. Here, old photos tell real stories from the past. Please subscribe, like, and share to help keep history alive.
On October 1, 1940, Albert Einstein and his stepdaughter Margot stood in Trenton, New Jersey, to take their oaths of American citizenship, a formal break from the Europe that had forced them to flee Nazi persecution. Muhammad Ali leaned from a ninth-floor window in January 1981 and accomplished in 20 minutes what police, a psychologist, and a minister had all failed to do, talking a suicidal young man safely down from a ledge. Before alarm clocks were common, knocker-uppers like Mary Smith walked the streets each morning armed with a pea shooter, blasting dried peas at customers' windows to rouse them in time for work. In 1937, 1 year after his abdication, the former king, now titled the Duke of Windsor, met Adolf Hitler in Germany alongside his wife, Wallis Simpson, in a visit that would long shadow his legacy. At just 14 years old in 1940, Princess Elizabeth delivered her first public address, speaking directly to the British children who had been evacuated from their homes to escape the dangers of the Second World War. Hospital beds packed head to toe with soldiers at the San Francisco Naval Training Station captured the scale of the 1918 Spanish flu, a pandemic that infected 500 million people and killed as many as 100 million worldwide. Lavery Vallee, known by her stage name Charmian, was a trapeze artist and strongwoman whose signature act, disrobing from full Victorian dress mid-swing, was captured for Thomas Edison's short film in 1901. Dennis Lynn Rader, the BTK strangler who murdered 10 people across the Wichita area between 1974 and 1991, photographed himself bound in his victim's clothing, images later discovered by police inside his home. In 1945, Princess Elizabeth became the only female member of the British royal family to serve in the military, training with the Auxiliary Territorial Service as both truck mechanic and driver during the Second. A U.S. Army Air Force's C-47 Skytrain cuts across the skies above the ancient pyramids of Giza in 1943, two worlds separated by millennia sharing a single frame of wartime history. Diana Bryant and her goddaughter Tyure Jones fell 50 feet from a collapsed Boston fire escape in 1975. Bryant died from her injuries hours later, while the child survived because her godmother's body broke the impact of the fall. Princeton University students gathered in 1893 after their annual snowball fight, a long-standing campus tradition that pitched the freshman class directly against their sophomore rivals each winter. By the age of 21, Nebraska-born Ralph Madsen stood 7 feet and 6 inches tall, and when he attempted to enlist in both the U.S. and Canadian military during World War I, he was refused on the grounds that he would be too large a target in the trenches. An orphaned boy clutched a stuffed animal amid the rubble of his bombed London home in 1945. His parents and brother dead beneath the ruins, his expression part confusion, part defiance, catching the eye of photographer Tony Frissell. Brooklyn Supreme, a red-roan Belgian stallion born in 1928, stood 6.5 feet tall and weighed over 3,000 pounds, making him the heaviest horse ever recorded. At Camp Funston in Kansas, rows of soldiers stricken by the 1918 Spanish flu lay in packed hospital wards, the opening chapter of a pandemic that would ultimately kill between 17 and 100 million people worldwide. During the First World War, as men shipped overseas, women stepped into their roles on the home front, including the daily work of delivering ice door to door, a trade that would itself disappear with the spread of home refrigeration in the decades that followed. Winston Churchill, Britain's wartime prime minister, posed with his beloved brown poodle named Rufus, a rare intimate glimpse of the man behind the statecraft. In April 1945, a Russian survivor liberated from Buchenwald by American forces pointed out a Nazi guard who had beaten prisoners, one of at least 43,000 people who died at a camp where records showed nearly 250,000 prisoners had been held. In thick fog over New York City in 1945, a B-25 Mitchell bomber struck the Empire State Building between the 78th and 80th floors, killing 14 people and causing $1 million in damage without compromising the tower's structural integrity. When it was erected in 1923, the Hollywood sign read not simply as a landmark but as an advertisement for a real estate development, its original lettering spelling out a name few who now see it would recognize. A 1940 vision of automated food delivery imagined a mechanized future that was still decades away, capturing an era when the gap between everyday life and technological ambition felt both thrilling and absurd. In the mid-1940s Netherlands, a woman navigated her daily route balancing 2 full buckets of milk on her bicycle, a quiet image of wartime resilience and practical ingenuity. Photographed in 1840 at the age of 94, Hannah Stille was born in 1746, 23 years before Napoleon and a decade before Mozart, making her one of the oldest individuals ever to be captured on camera. Crafted in 1555, the armor of Henry VI of Spain stands as both a work of martial engineering and a testament to the artistry poured into the instruments of 16th century European warfare. On Venice Beach in 1934, a group of young women played volleyball on stilts, an image that balances athletic ambition with the casual irreverence of California beach culture between the wars. Shot in Reims in 1917 using the early autochrome color process, a photograph of a newspaper seller captured everyday French street life in true color at a moment when the Western Front lay just miles away. In 1929, Vivian Bales rode her Harley-Davidson 5,000 miles across the country in 78 days, telling reporters that her motorcycle had become her key to the whole of the United States. Chinese noblewomen photographed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries stood for the camera in formal attire, preserving a record of a social world that would be utterly transformed within a generation. Photographed in the 1930s, a Maya ball court marker carved in the shape of a macaw's head offered a striking glimpse of the ceremonial architecture that had defined civic life in the ancient city of Copan in western Honduras. The first Coca-Cola bottling plant opened in Chattanooga, Tennessee, in 1899, marking the moment a soda fountain staple began its transformation into one of the most distributed commercial products in history. Marketed in the 1980s as the ultimate small business machine, the personal computer of that decade looked nothing like the tool it would become. Its bulk and complexity a measure of how far the technology still had to travel. Pablo Picasso rendered a rooster in 1938 with the compressed, confrontational energy that defined his late pre-war work, the image carrying the taut atmosphere of a Europe moving toward catastrophe. Loggers rode on the front of a train crossing a trestle bridge through Oregon's Cascade Mountains in the early 1900s, a casual image of the dangerous intimacy between industrial timber harvesting and the mountain terrain it consumed. Photographed in 1929, shafts of sunlight fell through the vast windows of Grand Central Terminal in New York City, a view no longer possible today, blocked by the buildings that have since risen outside. A 1972 Kentucky Fried Chicken advertisement captured the visual language of a fast food industry still in the early stages of cementing its hold on American eating habits, the imagery as much a product of its era as the food itself. Produced between 1977 and 1991, Century Martial Arts kit jeans offered the appearance of ordinary denim alongside the flexibility of a stuntman's wardrobe, a functional solution to a problem most trousers quietly ignored. The Cullinan diamond, weighing 530 carats and known as the Great Star of Africa, was gifted to Edward VII by the Transvaal government in 1907 and set into the British royal scepter, where it remains among the crown jewels to this day. Photographed in Palermo in 1865, fresh pasta hung drying on outdoor racks outside a local shop, a document of artisanal food production that had changed little for centuries since the pressures of industrialization. Fifth Avenue in July 1913 showed a city still balanced between the horse-drawn age and the automobile era, the street alive with the layered noise of a New York in the middle of its own transformation. In 1970, the first tower of the World Trade Center rose above Lower Manhattan, a steel skeleton still ascending toward a skyline it would dominate for the next 3 decades before its destruction in September 2001. In In 1970, Czechoslovak railroad workers turned to a MiG-15 jet engine to defrost frozen tracks during a severe snowstorm, repurposing Cold War aviation technology for the productive demands of winter rail maintenance. A gentleman in a zebra-drawn carriage navigated the streets of London in 1913, his chosen mode of transport making a spectacle of both wealth and eccentricity in an Edwardian city that had seen most things but perhaps not quite this. A group of Chechen men gathered for a wedding in the 1880s were photographed by George Kennan, leaving a rare visual record of a society and a set of traditions that the coming century would subject to relentless upheaval. In the 1940s, Pittsburgh's industrial skyline was so thick with coal smoke that the city's own residents described it as blocking out the sun entirely, a daily condition that turned the air itself into a measure of the cost of industrial progress. In 1957, drive-in restaurants cooled customers' cars using portable cold air units delivered directly to the window, a service that captured the era's ingenuity in meeting the demands of a car culture that had made the automobile the center of American social life. Introduced in 1932 and inspired by Leonardo da Vinci's sketches, the Dynasphere was a single or two-seat monowheel vehicle that proved so difficult to control it never advanced beyond novelty, and was never put into mass production. A woman photographed in Sarajevo in 1912 by Albert Kahn displayed her tattoos for the camera, a document of a centuries-old tradition of Bosnian Catholic tattooing that survived Ottoman rule and that most of the watching world knew nothing about. A San Angelo, Texas, grocery store in November 1939 showed staff stacking packaged goods on display racks, a scene of routine commerce that was itself a marker of the slow shift towards self-service retail that would reshape American shopping within a generation. Between roughly 1915 and 1920, daredevil John Reynolds balanced on two tilted chairs placed over a chimney on the rooftop edge of a Manhattan skyscraper, performing the kind of act that drew crowds and defied both gravity and common sense in equal measure. Taken in 1839 or 1840 at New York University, the portrait of Dorothy Catherine Draper made by her brother Dr. John Draper is believed to be the earliest photographic portrait produced in the United States, taken within the first year of Daguerre's announcement of the daguerreotype process. In March 1979, Philips engineer Joop Sinju introduced the compact disc to the world in Holland, unveiling the product of a Sony-Philips collaboration that would become the global standard for recorded audio and render the vinyl record commercially marginal within a decade. Racegoers at the Hippodrome de Longchamp in Paris in 1908 arrived dressed in the elaborate fashions of the late Edwardian era, the grandstand serving as a stage for social display as much as for the spectacle of the racing itself. A cowboy photographed around 1899 by the Smithsonian stares into the lens with an unhurried directness, a portrait made at the close of the era romanticized as the Wild West, and already giving way to fenced ranches and railroad towns. The cradle made for Napoleon's son in 1811 was a gift from the city of Paris to the emperor and his wife Marie-Louise on the birth of Napoleon Franz Karl, a piece of imperial ceremonial furniture made for a child whose fate history would decide very differently than its makers had imagined. During a visit to Spain in 1922, Albert Einstein stopped for lunch in La Espluga de Francolí and paused to be photographed with local children, a moment of informal warmth captured by photographer Casimiro Lana on the margins of an otherwise formal academic tour. The seven Sutherland sisters, photographed around 1900 with their father Reverend Fletcher Sutherland, built a career as a Barnum and Bailey singing act, whose defining feature was their extraordinary long hair, later capitalizing on that fame with a commercial line of hair and scalp care products. The construction sequence of the Eiffel Tower, documented between January 1887 and March 1889, recorded one of the most dramatic feats of 19th century engineering as Gustave Eiffel's iron lattice rose above the Paris skyline in just over 2 years. Henry M. Leland, founder of Cadillac, posed in 1906 alongside his Model M touring car, a photograph taken at the precise moment when American automotive manufacturing was moving from craft production toward the industrial ambition that would define the following century. 4 women loaded their luggage onto the running board of an Oldsmobile in Portland, Oregon around 1919. Their Airedale dog settling on top of the cases in a photograph that catches the early freedom of automobile travel opening up for American women in the years after the First World War. Photographed in Seattle in 1919, the stacked lumber drying at the Seattle Cedar Lumber Manufacturing Company's Ballard Mill rose over 50 feet high, each stack representing at least 9 months of seasoning before the wood was ready to be sold. The Panama Slide at Coney Island, built in 1908, drew adult visitors in particular to its chutes, becoming one of the amusement park's most popular attractions at a moment when Coney Island was defining what mass leisure looked like in urban America. The last photograph taken of Nikola Tesla in 1943 showed a man of 86 who died alone in room 3327 of the New Yorker Hotel, yet 2,000 people would attend his state funeral at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine 5 days later. A freight train moved across a high Arizona trestle in 1895 with 2 men standing on the roof of one of the cars, an image of the casual disregard for safety that characterized the early railroad era in the American West. In 1943, a bookmobile brought library services to children in rural Blount County, Tennessee, one of the traveling library programs that extended access to books across parts of America where a fixed library building was simply out of reach. A Minnesota family posed proudly with their new automobile in the early 1900s, participants in the first wave of car ownership that was beginning to reshape American life, landscape, and expectation all at once. Otto Frank returned in 1958 to the Amsterdam attic where he had hidden with his family during the German occupation, standing in the space where his daughter Anne had written the diary that would become one of the most widely read documents of the 20th century. A chimney sweep and his young assistant were photographed in London in 1877, a document of the child labor that remained embedded in Victorian working life 2 decades after Charles Dickens had made it a subject of public conscience. Iranian university students photographed in Tehran in 1971 inhabited a city and a society on the cusp of transformation, their everyday lives capturing a modernity that the Islamic Revolution of 1979 would fundamentally and permanently reorganize. A horse-drawn cart passed through a tunnel cut directly into the base of a giant sequoia in Yosemite National Park in 1879, a practice that treated the world's largest living organisms as tourist spectacles rather than irreplaceable natural monuments. 2 boys sat inside the Willamette meteorite in 1911 at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, dwarfed by the 14.5-ton iron mass, the largest meteorite ever found in North America and the 6th largest in the world. The carving of Mount Rushmore, photographed in 1939, showed workers midway through a project that had begun in 1927 and would take until 1941 to complete, blasting and sculpting the granite faces of 4 American presidents into the Black Hills of South Dakota. Invented in the Netherlands in 1926 by Death, a portable extendable bridge designed to be transported by handcart offered a practical solution to the particular challenge of crossing water in a low-lying country latticed with canals and ditches. Photographed in the late 1800s, the village of Staithes on the North Yorkshire coast appeared frozen in a centuries-old pattern of fishing and coastal life that industrialization had reached only partially, and that the sea itself continued to dictate. The Sony FX300 Jackal, released in 1978, packed a miniature CRT television screen, a cassette player recorder, and AM/FM radio into a single portable device, a piece of consumer electronics that anticipated the convergence that the digital age would later make routine. Published in 1900 and titled The Unrestrained Demon, this anti-electricity cartoon captured the anxieties of a public grappling with force they could neither see nor fully understand, at a moment when electrical infrastructure was beginning to transform daily life across the industrialized world. The first recorded freezing of Niagara Falls occurred in the winter of 1848, when an extreme cold snap halted the flow entirely, a phenomenon that would recur and draw photographers across the late 19th and early 20th centuries to document its eerie suspended power. A 1938 photograph by Alfred Eisenstadt captured a window display on Memphis's Beale Street, the commercial face of a neighborhood already legendary as a center of blues music and African-American cultural life in the American South. A couple walked the beach at Atlantic City in 1890, dressed in the full formal attire expected of the era even in leisure, a detail that measures how far the social conventions around public recreation would shift in the decades that followed. A 1970s men's fashion advertisement promoted the open-chest shirt as an instrument of attention, its language of dazzle and double takes reflecting an era when male fashion had briefly abandoned restraint as its governing principle. A Sami woman photographed in Finnish Lapland in 1917 held an infant while a toddler stood beside her, a rare documentary image of everyday life within an indigenous Arctic community at a moment when their traditional way of life was already under pressure from the encroaching modern state. The Titanic and her sister ship Olympic were photographed together at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast in 1910, side by side before their completion. One vessel destined for decades of service, the other for the most famous maritime disaster in history. Children gathered around a record player in the 1970s, sharing the communal experience of listening that the era's domestic technology made possible, a moment already distant from the solitary, on-demand listening that would define the generation that followed. A line of Lady Diana lookalikes waits to greet Prince Charles in Wellington in 1981, a scene that captures the extraordinary public fashion surrounding the royal couple in the year that would see them marry. This 16th century Polish armor is built from steel rings, combined with 1,074 separate steel plates, a remarkable example of the armorer's craft, now held in the collection of the Royal Armory in Krakow for visitors to study today. The Column of Constantine stands beside the Gazi Atik Ali Pasha Mosque in Constantinople, photographed in 1890, two monuments of differing ages captured side by side in the imperial capital that would later be renamed Istanbul. The Grateful Dead's Wall of Sound towered 3 stories high and 100 feet wide in 1974, weighing 75 tons across 6 independent systems and 11 channels, each speaker carrying one instrument or voice for exceptionally clear, distortion-free sound. Scientists study models of the moon's phases in 1962 as part of preparations for the United States manned flight to the moon, photographed by Fritz Goro during the early groundwork of the effort to land men on the lunar surface. This is among the first photographs taken of Tutankhamun's tomb after it was opened, sealed and undisturbed for more than 3,000 years, later colorized by dynamochrome to bring fresh life to one of archaeology's greatest discoveries. Manchester City footballer Mike Summerby demonstrates the built-in record player of his new Volvo P1800 in 1967, showing off an unusual luxury feature that turned the sports car into a genuine novelty of its time. Bruce Lee teaches his young son Brandon martial arts during the 1960s, a private moment between father and child that shows the discipline being passed down to the next generation within one of martial arts' most famous families. Mrs. Handy stands with vegetables she has just canned at Scotland, Maryland in 1940, photographed by Jack Delano in a scene that records the self-sufficient labor of home food preservation in rural America before the war. Workers assemble Sears and Roebuck catalogs in 1942, the thick mail-order volumes that sold Americans almost everything, including entire kit houses shipped by the company to be built piece by piece by their new owners. Formal portraits of this period rarely featured smiles, yet they can be found in photographs of everyday life, like this one taken in South Carolina, a small reminder that genuine expression survived outside the rigid conventions of the studio. A Mobot, or mobile robot, built by Hughes Aircraft's Electronic Labs, helps dress a woman in California in 1961, an early experiment in robots that imagined machines performing delicate hands-on tasks in everyday domestic settings. The first X-ray image, made in 1895 by Wilhelm Röntgen, showed the bones of his wife Bertha's hand with her wedding ring clearly visible. The discovery, named for the unknown X, won the first Nobel Prize in Physics in 1901. Egyptian men stand beside a fallen statue of Ramses II. In the late 1800s, the toppled monument of one of the ancient world's most powerful pharaohs, photographed centuries after the empire that raised it had crumbled into ruin. Horse-drawn streetcars still run among the gutted buildings and smoldering ruins at State and Madison Streets after the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Ordinary city life resuming amid the wreckage left by one of the era's most devastating urban disasters. 4.5 megabytes of data fill 62,500 punched cards in 1955, a vivid measure of just how much physical space digital information once demanded in the earliest decades of electronic computing. A family plays on a homemade 4-person swing in Finland in 1954, a simple wooden contraption built for shared use, capturing an ordinary moment of domestic fun in the years of recovery that followed the Second World War. Nellie Brown, an African-American cowgirl, was photographed around the 1880s, her portrait a rare record of a black woman working the American West, a present often overlooked in the enduring popular images of frontier life. Station staff physically pushed passengers into a packed train during rush hour at Shinjuku Station in Tokyo in 1968, a scene capturing the so-called subway pushers and the sheer density of one of the world's busiest transit systems. Two of the roughly 250 ancient stone towers that still stand across Tibet and southwest China rise in this photograph. Structures scholars believe were built between 200 and 1400 CE for storage, defense, status, and signaling. A worker and his supervisor stand together at a car factory in Moscow in the Soviet Union in 1954, photographed by Henri Cartier-Bresson and later colorized by Klimbim, a quiet study of labor behind the Iron Curtain. Dogchild, a scout for the Northwest Mounted Police, stands with his wife, known as the Only Handsome Woman, both members of the Blackfoot Nation, photographed at Gleichen, Alberta, around 1890, a rare portrait of a First Nations couple. Concorde's cockpit ranked among the most complex in aviation history, demanding a minimum crew of 3, with a dedicated flight engineer working alongside the 2 pilots to manage the immense technical challenge of supersonic passenger flight. Charlie Chaplin appears strikingly ahead of his time in this 1922 image, a moment so familiar it reads as an early version of the modern distracted boyfriend scene, captured on film long before the meme existed. Men stand inside a 45-ton steel pipe being installed at the Hoover Dam in 1935, the sheer scale of the structure made plain by the workers dwarfed within the vast conduits that would carry the Colorado River's waters. A Swedish bride poses for her portrait around 1880, a formal image preserving the traditional wedding dress and bearing of a young woman from 19th century Sweden, captured in one of the early decades of photographic portraiture. Winston Churchill is photographed in 1898, a portrait of the future British Prime Minister as a young man, taken long before the wartime leadership that would one day come to define his place in history. The original Moulin Rouge is captured in 1914, the year before it burned down, the photograph made using the early Autochrome Lumiere color process, preserving the famous Parisian cabaret in color in its final form. A Burger Chef outlet is seen around 1970, a snapshot of the American fast food chain at its height, when such restaurants were rapidly reshaping how the country ate during the post-war boom in roadside convenience dining. A tower of confiscated barrels stands ready to be burned during Prohibition in 1929, the seized alcohol destined for destruction under the nationwide ban that outlawed the production and sale of liquor across the United States. A gas station stands in Washington, D.C. In 1920, an early roadside fuel stop captured the dawn of the automobile age, when such stations were just beginning to spread across America's growing cities and highways. Crew repair the hull of the Graf Zeppelin in mid-flight over the Atlantic Ocean in 1934, photographed by Alfred Eisenstadt, a striking image of maintenance carried out in the open air far above the sea. A family lives in a tree stump house 22 feet across in 1901, some of these hollowed-out dwellings rising 2 or 3 stories and fully equipped with space to cook, sleep, and store everything a household required. A horse-drawn omnibus runs the route between the Panthéon and the Place Courcelles in Paris in 1912, a glimpse of the city's public transport in the last years before motor vehicles fully replaced the horse on its streets. A British soldier arrives at the docks from overseas in 1945 and meets his 8-month-old daughter, a homecoming that captures one of countless reunions between returning servicemen and the children born while they were away at war. A man cradles a donkey in his lap in a photograph captioned "Rockabye Baby," an undated image thought to come from around the 1910s, a piece of gentle, absurd humor preserved from the earliest era of casual photography.